Welcome to the Zero Input Agriculture podcast. Today, I'm talking to Michael Longfield. So, tell us a bit about your background and the path that led you into your particular kind of agriculture.
I've been on a land base since I was 20 years old. I've always wanted to do some form of ecological living. That's pretty much guided my early development through my teens. And I dropped out of college and wanted to immediately start homesteading or start some kind of project. I first was introduced to like ecological living pretty much like in middle school. I had just a fascination with eco villages and alternative forms of living and exploring subcultures and what exists outside of the dominant paradigm of society. And that really kind of guided my looking into other forms of living and interacting with human beings. And luckily, I was blessed to get a land base so early in my age. And before I got interested in propagating and farming, I was focusing mostly on herbalism. So I studied traditional Chinese medicine. And that interest in medicinal plants and ecological living eventually led to plant propagation, food forests, permaculture, eventually syntropic agriculture.
Excellent. So, we're going to flip things around a little bit today and talk about syntropic agriculture first, because I think it's a topic that a lot of people in our community have heard about, but they don't necessarily know much of the details because there is quite a lot to the theory and it takes a bit of time to unpack it. So, do you want to have a go at telling a broad audience about what syntropic agriculture is and how it's worked for you?
Yeah, there's a lot of details you can go into, but there's some broad frameworks that really guide my breeding practices and how I grow crops. And it really fits well into just my understanding of reality and understanding of life. And the big principle is nature isn't static, it is going somewhere. We are in a developmental process. And when energy, like from the sun, is entering a system, life gets created, intelligence accumulates, energy accumulates, information accumulates, and it goes through a process of development of complexity. So, this is a natural process of energy, of living matter that happens. And we can steer this developmental process, we can guide it, and we can speed it up. So, depending on what stage the living system is in this developmental process of moving towards complexity, storing energy, building this syntropic spiral of life and complexity, we can apply different practices to speed that. And it also gives us contexts for where our plants best exist through that natural evolutionary process of plant communities, of ecosystems. So the primary concept I focus on is the maximization of photosynthesis. And everything else comes downstream of the maximization of photosynthesis. I see almost all gardening and farm practices are trying to, most gardening farming practices are simply trying to simulate a healthy ecosystem. It's trying to trick a plant into thinking it's growing somewhere where it would like to live. But the foundational strategy that all healthy ecosystems are based off of how it creates that syntropic spiral, is the maximization of photosynthesis, increasing the amount of solar energy that is cycling into a system. So downstream from maximization of photosynthesis, we have different syntropic principles. And that is planting plants very densely in in multi-species strata. So there's layers of trees, layers of plants, because some plants can accumulate solar energy at different levels of shading. So we're going in 3 dimensions, maximizing how much sunlight can be entered into the food system. So then the second principle of syntropic agroforestry that I focus on is hormonal growth pulses through the system. So the other way that succession is sped up through the system, beyond increasing the amount of solar energy entering into the ecosystem, is disturbances. And every time there's a disturbance in an ecosystem, be it through large mammals crashing through a forest or a windstorm, there is a hormonal growth pulse that occurs where it triggers developmental growth hormones from those plants. So we can, perhaps that it happens occasionally in an ecosystem, but we can have that happen more frequently by timing strategically pruning cycles into our agro ecosystem. This, in a sense, comes downstream of maximizing photosynthesis because we are letting those plants grow to their till the end of their growth cycle, where their ability to photosynthesize is starting to decline. And then we will do a targeted pruning that sets back the plant and starts another set of a growth cycle. So now we're concentrating the amount of sunlight entering the system. And with that, we're concentrating the amount of root exudates that enter the system. The photosynthesis equation essentially is turning sunlight into sugar. And sugar being the form of matter closest to sunlight, because sunlight energy converts into sugar, which is the primary energy currency of life. And that enters into the soil food web via root exudates. So we're increasing the amount of life, we're increasing the amount of root exudates, we're increasing the amount of the microbiome in the soil. And essentially, the microbiome in the soil is the intelligence, the information of the entire ecosystem. So complexifying the ecosystem with multiple species, leading to more of a complex soil food web, leading to more energy cycling into the system, is more information into the system. We're steering the evolution of an ecosystem into increased complexity, order, information, and not quite sure what's on the other end of that, but it's kind of a pure potentiality. We're entering this creative process. We're interacting directly with the evolution of ecosystems. And like human beings are, in a sense, just another species in the ecosystem. We are the ecosystem. And our rightful place in the ecosystem when we are participating in the highest good is the speeding of that evolutionary process, speeding of that successional framework that's increasing order, complexity, creativity, and potentiality of life in general.
That is a beautiful outline of what is a the system was developed over a lifetime in Brazil, syntropic originally, but I think the principles are being exported to other parts of around the world quite successfully. I would maybe also add, if people are familiar with managed intensive rotational grazing, it's a system that operates on similar principles for grasslands with herbivores. Syntropic in many ways feels like the human interactions with forestry kind of systems, equivalent of that, of getting the timed impacts, getting the diversity, restoring the mineralogical and hydrological cycles through maximizing photosynthesis. Like it feels like it's the same solution, just in a different kind of ecosystem.
Yes, definitely. They both similar framework, maximization of photosynthesis, time disturbance, but in that case, it's with grassland. But the difference I would say is kind of the understanding of ecosystem succession, that ecosystems are going somewhere. They're not static. So instead of trying to keep it into a perpetual grassland, there is a developmental process that life wants to go. And that's where some of that higher level of abundance and information can come from riding that spiral out from grassland into a complex, long lived forest ecosystem.
Yeah. Now that you've got your eye in as a syntropic farmer, is that the right word? When you see unmanaged landscapes, often what most people would think of as like natural landscapes, do you see stagnation and simplification in places where other eyes look and think it's just nature?
I think I start seeing where a lot of areas that you might normally think of, like, oh, that's a woodland, you can start observing that actually that's an early succession forest.
Mm.
So a lot of times people are seeing, oh, that is nature, and it is groovy, that is nature, but you can see the remnants of disturbance from the destruction, the ecocide that has happened in the past. We're not in this higher order, abundance, complex, climax ecosystem. We're still on our way through that from logging and ecocide from the past. And those woodlands are our best example of what plants thrive in our current conditions. And that's where we can get some of our best insight of what types of plants we can be planting at that stage of succession. And it's interesting thinking this way because you can break down in syntropic agroforestry, we break down stages of ecosystem succession. We have placenta one, that's like your grass, your annuals. Then we have placenta two, that's your perennial herbs, some of your herbaceous perennials. And then you have secondary, that's when you start getting your long lived trees. You have early, mid, late secondary. So there's all development of a woody perennial food system. And then we have our climax, which an abundant, full ecosystem. And so different plants we're trying to grow, we might not have success with them because we're growing them at the wrong stage of ecological succession. So someone might think, oh, this plant grows poorly in my climate, but it could not necessarily be a climactic issue. It could just be the successional stage of the land you're working on. And we all have different levels of degradation on our land base that we exist on. And I see it as an exciting opportunity for breeders because now we can breed crops for each different successional stage with the acknowledgement that nature is moving somewhere. We're not static in that successional stage. We can choose to or not move with that force of succession and help moving it forward through many of these syntropic agroforestry practices, but it gives a place for maybe super low input thinking for like what plants can thrive on a in the most degraded area. We need those plants because those are our plants that we'll be planting at the early stage of a syntropic agroforestry project. It's all useful. And depending on where we do this work, there's going to be different levels of degradation. So we kind of need a consortium, a toolkit of staple crops at each level of that stage.
I mean, it's one of
Um,
the keys for scalability of these forest solutions that, like, you could take a climax species and force it to grow in a grassland by clearing the grass around the base of it and building a cage around it and watering it extra and giving it all of these supports. But you can only do that with so many trees. If you want to plant 1,000 trees per person, you can't afford to go back to each one of them and clear the grass around every few months to like give them a chance to dominate where they're not naturally wanting to grow. Um,
Right. And that's the major input is tricking these plants into thinking they're growing where they want to.
mm,
We're going, instead of working with the foundational principles of maximizing photosynthesis and building microbial life, we'd rather truck in compost and, expensive fertilizers. And and I think we're missing out on so much of the power of these plants because in many ways an organism is an extension of its environment. Those microbial communities, those plant families, that stage of succession, that is in a way an extension of its nervous system. For an example, if you just nuked a human being of all of its microbes, all of its natural symbiotic microbes, would it still be the same human being? What if you included mitochondria, which are a symbiotic, form? You'd be on life support. You'd be
yep.
dead.
Yeah.
So I think we keep reducing these plants, separating them from their natural context. And like the work of Dr. Christine Jones, she talks about how for microbes to perform their functions, we have to have enough of them. We have to have enough diversity of them, and we reach a critical threshold where they start activating, where they start performing different kinds of functions. And the requirement for those microbial communities is diversity of plants, maximization of exudates. And she talks about how microbes perform horizontal gene transfer with other plants. So those microbial genes, in a sense, are an extension of those plants in their environmental context. So we're disconnecting plants from that gene flow, from that informational flow that they would typically be connected to in their natural successional context, and then we're expecting them to perform well.
So, what benefits does syntropic management offer in terms of reducing inputs? Like, can you think of examples of typical inputs where syntropic manages to just reduce them or even eliminate them?
The idea would be that there would be zero outside inputs and we would be replacing all inputs with ecological function. If you have a healthy enough soil microbiome, it should eliminate all need for fertilizers. Another principle in syntropic agriculture is that hormones are more foundational than nutrients. So we're playing with these levers of the hormonal status of plants, which is actually more foundational than nutrition. And it should ultimately lead to not needing any sort of outside inputs.
It's an interesting idea, particularly with mineral nutrition, that the subsoil and the bedrock goes however many kilometers down. Like any element that you want is theoretically there, but the life needs to put it into motion and to balance the different ingredients to suit the needs inside the cell. Like often an imbalance in antagonistic minerals is more of an issue than just the absolute level. I've got that issue here a little bit. I've got a very high magnesium soil that's relatively low in calcium, and those two elements kind of compete with each other for absorption, even though they have very different roles in living systems.
Like there's been different research with cover crops and cover crops that have more than 12 plus species in them perform better than a cover crop with less species and nitrogen. So the cover crop without fertilizer with lots of species outperforms the cover crop with a low amount of species with nitrogen. So
Have
we
you
can
seen?
kind
Oh,
of
sorry, you go.
we can I feel like there's a lot of reductionism where we try to kind of understand what's going on and reduce plant nutrition and plant health to this nutrient or this mineral, but nothing is going to take the place of creating a natural, healthy ecosystem.
Do you suspect that soil microbial communities vary dramatically, like season to season, year to year? Because like you'll get one year when one particular plant family just goes gangbusters and then it goes back to baseline after that, or they have really bad years where they just don't seem to want to grow. And nothing's changed in the management, nothing's changed in the soil type, but just the combination of rainfall and temperature turning up at different times and maybe population dynamics in the microbe communities themselves having like a chaotic kind of swing. Do you have any thoughts or observations around that?
Not necessarily. I could consider multiple different things, but I wouldn't, I'm not exactly sure how that would relate to what microbial communities. We could be missing out on the overall intelligence of microbial life just by simply not having enough not having enough plant species growing in that area. So, I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this, but
Well, how about this thought? Is the syntropic outlook almost agnostic in terms of like soil tests and, microbial community surveys and all this kind of stuff? Like the amount of actual data that you can extract and analyze through like the modern scientific techniques compared to what is actually going on in a full complex system, it's like a drop in the ocean. Like you can do soil tests on your farm, but you're only going to be like, 6 inches deep in scattered locations. And the closer you look, the more you find there's all these little pockets where the soil composition is quite different. And the idea that you could ever test so much of the soil and then manage all of that data and then understand what to do with it so that you put exactly the right plant in exactly the right spot, why don't you just have 100 times more seeds of everything that you could ever use and just put them everywhere and let the plants sort it out? They've got the sensors inside them that tell them whether they can grow or not. So just ask the plant.
right, as I understand, it's come from observation of how life works. And then after the fact, different soil scientists and folks have gotten interested and tried to explain what's going on. And I think we're always limited by how we're reducing the complexity of life down.
I mean, a good example of this is the focus on legumes as being, these key nitrogen fixers in the environment. But the more we've looked, the more we've realized that there's symbiotic microbes free living in the soil, associated with pretty much every other plant, if you look carefully enough, that are also fixing nitrogen. And then you've got natural processes like lightning, which can dump huge amounts of nitrogen on the landscape too. So it was never even as narrow as just, oh, plant legumes and you'll get nitrogen. It's just we didn't have the tools to look closely enough to even have a hint that there was all of these other channels putting nitrogen into the
Right.
system.
And those nitrogen fixing bacteria won't be able to exist without creating a quorum of enough microbes in the first place. And that's an insight that is interesting that was found in syntropic agriculture, is there isn't really a focus on nitrogen fixing species, where typically in permaculture food forests we focus on nitrogen fixing species, but instead it's focusing on just simply the maximization of photosynthesis, which from that downstream of that is an increased amount of root exudates, which feed the microbes, which in ways we can barely understand, that we're continually learning about, but the complexity of life we're just starting to fathom, is creates enough nutrients and
Well,
nitrogen fixation.
it's an obvious question I've never seen proposed. If nitrogen fixation was such a powerful ability for legumes and nitrogen is limiting to growth, why isn't everything a legume? Like, why don't they completely dominate unmanaged ecosystems if they have this magical ability to produce all the nitrogen that they want? And if you look around the ecosystems of the world, there's only one that I've found that has an abnormally high dominance of nitrogen fixing legumes. And they are seasonally dry tropical locations. So they get really, really hot and dry for part of the year, and these legume trees drop all of their leaves. And then when the rain comes, they grow like crazy. But they're on soil types that are really high in available minerals. They're like recently mineralized soils, which are rare in the tropical zones because they usually get leached out. And as a consequence of all of this, those ecosystems tend to have surprisingly low soil carbon. So again, that antagonism between carbon and nitrogen, it's it's not straightforward to end up with high levels of both of them in a sustained system.
So with syntropic agriculture and breeding, it's interesting because in these establishment of these systems, people are planting an enormous amount of seed. There's an observation through syntropic agriculture that the direct seeding of plants creates better plants than transplants. And it's nice to see this movement of excitement for direct seeding species. And it appears that they're getting really good results with lots of this direct seeding into this macroorganism. And I've tried to think about what kind of different mechanisms might lead to their improvement of these genetics through direct seeding in syntropic systems. Mechanism I can explain it is microbial horizontal gene transfer. Those
Mm,
seeds directly connected to more information of life. And then another mechanism I've been considering is hormonal imprinting.
mhm.
And when an organism is early in its development, it, depending on what hormones it experiences early in its growth, it's sensitized to those hormones later in life. And we know that that is inheritable up to 1,000 generations for unicellular organisms, 3 generations in animal models. So if you're planting something outside of its natural hormonal context, perhaps outside of its a natural place in succession, it could be getting hormonal information of scarcity and of stress. And now that organism is more susceptible to the hormones of stress later in life.
Mm.
But in syntropic agroforestry, we're planting for plants for seeds to emerge in spring, where it's having that hormonal growth pulse of new life. And then we're also planting after a massive disturbance. So we're pruning back all of our support species, and then we're planting seeds, and those seeds are germinating in that increased microbial context and that increased hormonal context of growth. And I suspect that that's signaling to that plant of you're in a more complex, abundant ecosystem. And similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as you move up the pyramid of your needs, you have an opportunity for increased forms of expression and actualization. So the more we're separating our seedlings from the life of the microbes and from proper hormonal stimulus, the more we extract things from their natural environment, we're making them become less of who they are. We're removing them from that information in that potentiality. And there's some of our greatest plant breeders throughout history have believed in the idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, that these environmental forces influence life and the development of an organism. And increasingly we're having these mechanisms that are being revealed to us of how that could work. And it's observationally being proven in these syntropic systems. And I feel like breeders are kind of missing this lever that we could be utilizing of hormonally imprinting into the early developed plants growth hormones, hormones of abundance. And so my strategy for applying this is I have a hazelnut breeding project that I've been doing. I have rows of hazelnuts. They are mature. They have consolidated, creating a closed canopy. And this fall, my plan is to cut that entire hazelnut block to the ground. I'm going to take that biomass and I'm going to lie it on either side of that hazelnut row. So those hazelnuts are snugged between two rows of mulch. And I'm going to be planting the best genetics that I can find of hybrid hazelnuts, direct seeding them in between those previously planted hazelnuts. Mm-hmm. Then in spring, I'm going to have a massive hormonal growth pulse of all of those hazelnuts are now going to, that I just coppiced, are going to be signaling a massive hormonal growth pulse. Those seeds are now germinating in a new context than that previous generation of plants. So this idea of breeding woody species, growing them out, mass selecting them, selecting the best the best selections from those plantings, then cutting everything down and planting the next generation of seed in the next successional context. So that previous generation is helping to prepare the way for the next generation, increasing the life, increasing the information. So if I planted that same hazelnut seed in a field, I suspect it would be a different organism than if I planted that same hazelnut in the next successional stage of the planting. And if every generation we continually planted them in the increased information, the increased complexity of an increasing successional stage, with the microbial horizontal gene transfer and the hormonal imprinting, I see this as like a powerful mechanism that isn't being properly utilized or really thought about.
The model you're describing almost sounds like mentor grafting of seedlings on the entire ecosystem rather than like a chopped off scion plonked onto a rootstock.
Exactly. We are literally mentor grafting it to the earth.
Yeah.
To Gaia.
I love it. I love it.
So the ecosystem is the mentor. The seed is the pupil. Those early developing seeds, we know through the work of Ivan Maturin that they're more plastic. They're more susceptible to being steered. They're being programmed by their current environmental conditions. So what kind of stimulus are we giving our plants? How are we programming them? How are we training them?
Do you have any thoughts on annual crop breeders doing direct seeding versus transplants? Because I know in the popular suburban form of permaculture, which relies on very heavy mulching, often like underlays of cardboard and paper and all of that, where direct seeding is almost impossible, and growing transplants in like, half composted pine bark potting mix in a little grow tube before they go out into the ground. Do you suspect that way of producing home vegetables is missing out on a huge amount of opportunity for local adaptation?
Yeah, anecdotally, you hear all over the place of direct seeded things outperforming transplants. For example, a lot of times volunteers in my garden are where I get most of my calories from. They often are just have more vigor and are often more successful. Same thing with direct seeding trees. A lot of people have a lot of experience of them being better. One way people explain it is that if you transplant, you often lose the taproot. But that
Mm.
could just be one way of explaining this complex amount of mechanisms that are at play.
It's funny, in our area, we're on a fairly heavy clay, and when people plant out avocado trees from transplanted, like grafted trees, they usually die after a couple of years, no matter how much you care for them. And the way people explain it, it's, oh, the root hit the subsoil. And it's like, have you actually dug it up and looked at the root system? Like, it's like saying a demon possessed it. Like, it's just a story that we tell ourselves, but it's not actually connected to anything. But if you direct sow avocado seeds, they do fine. Like they take maybe a little bit longer to produce and the fruit will be variable. So if you're doing a commercial orchard, that could be disastrous. But if you're a home grower, it doesn't matter. And yeah, I always thought it was mostly due to root system structure that like once they get twisted around inside a cramped pot, they never really regain their architecture. But I think you're right. I
Right.
think that there's more going on with this story in terms of microbes and hormones and genetic flexibility in that early germination phase. Do you
Right.
have,
Or often large trees large transplants will underperform small transplants as well.
yeah,
And the
yeah, I
smaller
found that too.
transplanted tree will outpace the growth of the larger transplanted tree. And,
It,
the more juvenile your plant is, the more plastic it is, hypothetically, the more susceptible it's going to be to
I,
imprinting.
I would also point out that this is a logistical and economic issue too, in terms of scalability of doing forest gardens. So if you have to buy, 2 to 3 foot tall potted trees from a nursery, it's extremely expensive, and you can only carry so many of them out into the field and dig these enormous holes to put them in, and then they have a really hard time settling in and adapting. The
Especially if you're doing syntropic agroforestry where you're relying on planting hundreds of seeds,
Yeah,
hundreds of plants, where maybe you would typically just have one plant. The densities we're talking about in these systems are kind of mind boggling for even permaculturists to imagine. It's
mm,
almost wanting a tree every single inch.
mm,
And it's hard you would never be able to plant all of those by hand. So it's kind of encouraging people direct seeding plants, but that gives such a great opportunity for people who are trying to do mass selection
yeah.
where it's so much more work potting these plants up and then planting them out. And if you're working with seeds, you care less about attrition and having to have them culled. So
So, do you have any advice for people who want to shift from the popular model of buying a big tree to, like, save time, moving in the direction of smaller and smaller seedling transplants and eventually direct seeding? Like, what are the strategies and like the logistics? Like, even just getting seed on scale for some desirable species can be a roadblock. So, do you have any thoughts on how to approach that?
yes, I would say you were making a traditional orchard row. I would first prepare that row like you would preparing a new garden bed, where you want a mostly weed free material, a weed free bed, and conditioned soil. So, perhaps till a row and have a weed free bed. Then plant perhaps your purchase grafted trees at your normal density that you would be planting them, perhaps 15 feet. And then in between each of those grafted trees, transplant some kind of long lived emergent species that will grow above your your grafted trees. Now, in that row in between all of those plants, get all the seed that you can of plants that are thriving in your area, mix them all together. So now you're having that complex cover crop of multi species that's needed to have that critical mass of microbial life in order for it to start doing things, and plant that right in that row. And I would include these support species that are thriving in poor conditions in your area, but perhaps also include some plant you're interested in breeding or doing some kind of mass selection. Like in spring, I'm going to be doing this with a new row, and I'm purchasing lots of cold hardy citrus fruits that can just bear they can't survive in my zone, but they're close to being able to survive in my zone. I'm going to purchase those fruits from an orchard. I'm going to eat that fruit, save all those seeds, and in that in row woody crop, cover crop, you could kind of think about it.
Mm.
I'm going to plant just hundreds, as many as I can, of those citrus seeds. Now, those citrus, they'll come up along with all my support species. I'll prune the support species to not conflict with my main potted, grafted plants that I have. Those citrus are just going to come up. They're pumping, they're increasing photosynthesis, they're increasing the life process, they're pumping root exudates, they're feeding the whole community, they're helping everything work together in the community. And maybe 99.9% of them will die over winter. But in the meantime, they're doing their work. There'll be a 1 year cover crop for me. And now I have an opportunity to select for cold hardiness that first year.
Two points to add to that. So the first thing is you don't have to be a purist. You can mix and match different kinds of plant material from different sources to, like, they've each got pros and cons. So yeah, if you can get those large expensive trees established, you can have a predictable high quality, grafted fruit, and but it's a bit more work kind of getting them settled in. The other thing is with direct sowed tree crops, I think a lot of us are used to vegetables where if you can't get the light and the fast growth with an annual, you basically miss the opportunity and they kind of stunt and wither away. Like we used to, if you don't clear the weeds away from your seedling vegetables, you're going to miss out on a crop. There's a window of opportunity. You have to remember with tree crops, they're often quite happy to sit in a shady understory for years before they finally get their opportunity to get the light that they need and take off. Sometimes they prefer to be in the shade for a few years before they really mature. So that idea that you've got all of that woody support species that needs to be, cut back and controlled, you need to get to it eventually, but it's not quite as time critical as growing annual crops that mature really quickly.
Right. And with typical fruit tree crops, if you buy it from a nursery, it'll say full sun. But most of the time, those plants do fine in partial shade.
Mm.
There's different research papers that are put out in the US where apples maintain productivity under 40% shade. So we're limited in the stratification that we're doing in typical orchards. So we're limiting the amount of photosynthesis that we're entering into our system. And by limiting the photosynthesis, we're limiting the amount of energy that's cycling through that living system. And energy cycling into a living system is what is required for it to grow in complexity and to get out of that entropic death spiral and start spinning in the other direction of accumulation, complexity, intelligence, and information. So we're just like disconnecting everything from the life processes and expecting them to thrive. And yeah, a lot of times, if your preferred long-term crop are in the shade of maybe a fast-growing crop, I mean, that could be for the benefit because it's not at the successional stage for that long-lived tree species to fully thrive. So in that citrus planting plan that I was discussing, I'm also going to be including lots of canna and lots of pokeweed, which is pokeweed's a fleshy herbaceous perennial with a taproot that's a pioneer species in my climate. So I expect that first year, my citrus seedlings are not going to get very big. They'll be very small and they'll be in the understory of hopefully a fully like consolidated, snugly packed of canna and poke. And that first year, I'll have all that canna and poke to cut down as biomass to lay down on either side of my tree row. And I expect 95% of those canna seedlings to die that first winter. So in that same time that I'm creating, because I for these syntropic systems, you need those plant roots. You need that chlorophyll to harvest photosynthesis. And at the same time, I'm able to get that need of planting an enormous amount of support species, but kind of double dip as a cold hardy breeding program for both canna and citrus in the same row.
That's one thing I wanted to ask about with the syntropic management. Is it limited by the amount of human labor that is interacting with the system? And is there potential for animals to be used to do some of that impact?
I think there is, and animal impact has not been as much of a thing utilized in most of the syntropic systems that I've looked into. It's been mostly based on human management, but I think there's an increasing amount of interest in integrating animals into these disturbance events. And I would say human humans it is one of the main limiting factors because there's actually an enormous amount of work to do of multiple times a year manually pruning all these plants. But for everything, it requires a lot of labor for humans. Every form of farming, for the most part. So at least with that amount of labor that's required, you're like actually doing something in a sense that you're building momentum instead of just working uphill fighting a stagnant system.
Do you suspect that there's potential for breeding support species to be either easier to do the management with human labor, or could even be like self-terminating? You know how some cover crops are selected so that they like winter kill, and then you've just got that biomass left in the spring to use? I'm just wondering if those ideas can be applied to woody or more complex agroecosystems.
Well, I think so with pushing cold hardiness, growing things right outside of its zone, and most of it's going to die on its own.
Mm.
But a lot of things are cold just because they stop thriving in the successional context. Like one pioneer species I grow a lot of is autumn olive or Russian olive, and I, you know, could make a lot of people very angry for planting that because it's a very aggressive pioneer species. So you could think, okay, can we breed this to phase out of the system to be called easier? But they tend to call themselves once they're in the understory of a more complex system. So in a lot of ways, they phase out naturally when their stage and succession has passed. Typically, when they're in the understory, and then they're just more susceptible to being cut. When they're cut back, they don't recover as well anymore.
Mm. So let's move on a bit. What crops are you breeding that you're most excited about? Tell us a bit about the direction you're trying to take them and the strategies that you're using in breeding.
So the what I have the longest history with is I started planting lots of genetically diverse chestnuts in 2014. So now I have a lot of mature trees that I've been in kind of the fun stage of selecting from. And I'm culling an enormous amount of trees. But instead of thinking of that as um, some big hassle of removing these chestnut trees, I'm thinking of them as now they're my support species. Now, when I cut down those chestnut trees, I have an enormous amount of biomass to lay down in my rows of chestnuts. And so these chestnut rows that I planted very densely because I was doing mass selection, now I'm opening up by removing those other trees. I now have a forest ecosystem underneath those chestnuts that was previously just a poor quality pasture. as I'm laying these culled trees on either side, I have this nice bed of forest soil that I can now plant into. So now I'm in this like new context. I'm in a new environment than I started with, which makes me start thinking about this idea of successional plant breeding. If I take the best performing of my chestnut trees and I plant those seeds in the understory of that original chestnut block, mentoring those seeds to the earth, what will be the next generation of trees in that new given context. But it also is giving me an opportunity to plant a lot of plants I've been interested in for a long time, but didn't have the right conditions for. And that's a lot of those medicinal forest species. So now in that understory, I'm able to plant things that like some shade, like Schizandra and Codonopsis. My original interest in the plant world was through traditional Chinese medicine. And we have a category of herbs that we call tonic herbs. They're kind of similar to how some people think about superfoods.
Hmm.
Essentially, a medicinal herb that you don't have to worry about taking too much. It's an herb you can eat as a food almost with accumulation of positive effects like chi tonics, accumulation of energy. And there's a long history of using these different herbs medicinally at different times or for increasing longevity, but they happen to often be forest perennial species. And I haven't really had a good like area to start cultivating them. And many times where I would kind of force them to locations that they didn't thrive in, they would do poorly.
Mm.
So now I have this whole new template, whole new area to start working with things like Schizandra and Codonopsis. So
Are you,
chestnuts have been,
I just meant to ask, are you planning on doing any breeding work with Codonopsis and Schizandra?
I would like to. This year, I'm collecting two different species of Schizandra, the typical one that's used medicinally, but another one that is supposedly even tastier. And
Mm.
I hope to look into hybridizing them, but for now, I'm just collecting them and growing them. But my interest in chestnuts was like, okay, let's grow a food that people can literally live off of. We have history of people using chestnuts as a staple crop. So we know that they are a viable staple crop.
Mm.
And a big interest for me is, finding foods that can grow with low inputs that people can thrive off of and that can be a food source intergenerationally. So chestnut was kind of like the bread and butter of the farm. And I'm selecting for nut size, vigor, and flavor are flavors increasingly my interest when working with chestnuts.
Hmm.
Some kind of just taste like potatoes, but others have like vanilla and different like complex notes, almost like a whiskey, like a American black walnut, if anyone's had that.
Now, you mentioned hazelnuts as well, another major staple crop for your part of the world. Because I don't think we mentioned, just in case anyone is unsure, you're in the northeastern United States somewhere?
I'm in the central United States in southern Illinois, the tip of the state of Illinois near Kentucky. I'm right where the two major rivers, kind of the big arteries, meet in the US, which is the Ohio and the Mississippi
Hmm.
River. It's zone 7A. I'm like 700-foot elevation. I have the continental effect. So I have 4 seasons. I have a decent winter, but due to the continental effect, it gets very hot and humid where I'm at. So I
Mm.
pretty much have all the pest and disease pressure you can imagine with the heat and humidity pressure, with also plants needing to be able to survive a winter. So
Mm.
it's a pretty interesting location.
Getting back to the understory perennial herbal plants, do you have any thoughts or strategies on how you could do the breeding of them? Because particularly with perennials, one of the difficulties compared to annuals, even compared to trees, is if they are vegetatively persistent, and like self-propagating through runners, once they're established in a suitable location, it's very difficult to turn over generations and like do selections and then start again. So do you almost feel like you've got one opportunity to do hybridization, and then from that hybrid swarm, you can select out the forms that have superior traits?
I need to consider that. That's a good point. But also, I have different tree rows, so I can move them from
Mm,
one row to another, perhaps. Really, my goal with Shazandra and Cottonopsis right now is to just get as much diversity as I can of seed and
mm,
start selecting and then going from there. And just the little I've looked into it, just realizing, oh, there's all kinds of species of Cottonopsis. Oh, there's
mm.
multiple species of Shazandra. So I think there's a lot of potential there.
That's what I'd worry about, that you'll probably have one of those species that starts to spread itself, and eventually all of that niche will be taken up. So you might have a limited window of opportunity to get the hybridization happening, maybe through hand crossing, just to make sure it's happening. Because otherwise, if you're relying on spontaneous hybrid seeds landing in the right spot to grow and then not being dominated by the non-hybrid ones, it's kind of it's a longer shot. And yeah, I just speaking from experience, because I've planted out large areas with hybrid cannas to do like mass selection, and they're not going anywhere. Like if I want them to leave to like plant a new generation of seedlings, I'm gonna have to get out there and dig them all out myself. Or maybe get some pigs and like put them on the patch and let them feast.
Right. Or
Mm.
just, yeah, make the new location somewhere else and turn
Yeah,
those cannas into your support species for
yeah.
the next succession of your plant breeding, like some kind of woody species.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So, but I mean, eventually you run out of room. It's almost interesting, the ecological devastation of the last century or two. Like in your part of the world, in my part of the world, virtually all of the forests were cut down. Like you look at historic photos, and it's a moonscape. We're coming in on the tail of that revegetation, and we've got a limited window of opportunity to steer the direction that the revegetation grows. And I think that's an important historical context. And it means
Yes.
we can look at that massive disturbance as an opportunity rather than just a tragedy.
And it also puts so much importance to the work that we're doing because the ecological material conditions that we create now will help create the framework for the social relations in the post industrial future. So much of social relations are based on the state of scarcity compared to abundance. And if we can't create ecological low input food systems, we're going to have to rely on food systems that require an enormous amount of labor and have scarcity. And the fear is that we could recreate some kind of feudal system in the post-industrial future if we don't have a surplus of calories. So the importance of creating long-lived, low-input ecological food systems is like incredibly important, and the difference of the the trajectory of the post-industrial future.
Mm. Would you say that we're living through a kind of golden age for the accessibility of genetic diversity? Like you look at the people who came like even a generation before us doing like tree crop breeding, they had such a huge amount of work to do just getting diverse genetics of a particular crop in one place.
Mm-hmm.
Been your experience like in terms of accessing that diversity to start your own project?
And it's incredibly available, especially with between different government seed banks and the internet and these amazing plant communities that we have, and just the generosity of this community of people who do want to share. We are at this incredible moment, and I kind of see genetic material as information. I see it as energy. We have in these ecological systems, we have access to this increased flow of hereditary information. And typically that was spread around by birds and different animals. So it's cycled through the ecosystem slowly. And it's almost like we've become these very long distance traveling birds spreading this heredity information across the globe at a time where we have this massive disturbance event, where we have this increased need for this information. So it's pretty exciting, like what the potentiality is of that, what kind of world we're steering, what kind of world we're creating. Because I like to see, we're in a developmental process, and we're in this process of increasing life energy. And if we can make sweeter, larger fruits, and that ripples out to the ecosystem for animals and humans alike, of having just increased energy density, how that will ripple outward is pretty mind bending.
Are there any species or genetics that you have on your wish list that you haven't been able to source?
Not really. I guess I should dream bigger. Oh, there are. I probably can't pronounce the names, but all sorts of weird, obscure stuff. If we could get things from higher elevation, different, more cold hardy tropical plants, that
Mm,
because a big interest of mine is the potential of hybridizing different native temperate plants with related tropical or subtropical species. So I am starting to collect plants in the custard apple family.
hmm
So I recently acquired seeds of the sugar apple,
hmm
and I'm growing those out. I'd like to start gathering seeds of lots of different plants in that family, because we have a native in that family that is the pawpaw.
hmm
And as far as I know, I don't know anyone that's tried hybridizing cherimoya, custard apple, sugar apple with the pawpaw. Something to be explored.
hmm it's interesting because either through artificial growing spaces like great heated greenhouses, you could potentially get a tropical species flowering within walking distance of cold hardy temperate species. But we've got other technologies at our fingertips. So, for example, you can collect and dry the pollen of many species, and it stores stably as long as you keep it at a consistently low temperature. And I know from my days in research laboratories, you can put packages in the post with dry ice. So that is a culture of people collecting and storing and sharing pollen over the entire planet that we could do for the foreseeable future while we've got all of that technology at our fingertips.
Exactly. It's amazing. What kind of things can we create? Because I see us as just a creative agent in the ecosystem. Our big brains have a lot of potential to do some amazing and creative things with life, as we, keep working and deepening our connection with, what creates life, the life process, the evolutionary process. And like another temperate plant that I'd like to hybridize with the subtropic is the Diospyros genus. We have our native here, the Virginiana, the American persimmon. It was hybridized with the khaki persimmon, and that was tricky to do. Luther Burbank couldn't figure it out, and eventually it happened. And then there's Diospyros nigra, the black sapote. And, if you look online, can you hybridize American persimmon with black sapote? Universally, you pretty much get a no, it's not possible. And that just makes me even more interested, because in a lot of ways, we're oversimplifying things. We're reducing hybridization to matching chromosomes, but
hmm
there's all kinds of ways that hereditary information is exchanged between plants,
Yep. Yep.
like the work of Maturin with graft hybrids and with mentor grafting. There's all these like esoteric, weird forms of plant breeding that are fringe, that kind of challenge some of the genetic paradigm of understanding. And challenges like that with black sapote and persimmon, it's a good opportunity to just like explore some of these weirder, fringer plant breeding techniques like mentor grafting.
Mm.
And like in mentor grafting, ideally the pupil is a hybrid because according to Maturin, those hybrids, interspecies hybrids, are more plastic.
Mm.
So we already have American persimmon and khaki persimmon crosses. So we already have that hybrid material. So I've been collecting lots of different hybrid persimmon seed. I have some black sapotes growing in pots to be as mentors. So in spring, the plan is to that hybrid persimmon seed grafted onto the black sapote and see if we can get some kind of horizontal gene transfer or whatever hereditary information gets exchanged between plants that perhaps we haven't even quantified yet.
Mm.
And I know you're interested as well in trying to
Yes,
do
yeah,
it,
yeah, yeah.
perhaps a triple hybrid with Diospyros,
I'm
perhaps
trying
with
the same thing here in the subtropics. So yeah, my black sapote collection has just settled in last year from large grafted pot-grown trees that I often, depending on our volatile climate, some years you can get them to settle in, other years it turns against you, and you just basically are better off giving up and trying again later. But yeah, I look like I've gotten lucky with the last batch. So give me a few years and I'll be trying the similar path.
and what's your plan? Because like you're trying to hand pollinate, are you thinking of doing some kind of, you know, any kind of weird tricks to encourage the pollination?
So yeah, it'll be hand pollination to begin, just with the mass. Well, you don't even need to do emasculation if you've got separate male and female flowers, so that's an advantage. You just need to stop the insects from doing it. And yeah, if just hand pollination from diverse combinations of genetics on the two sides of the species doesn't work, then I'll probably move on to trying mentor pollination to see if
Yes.
deactivated khaki persimmon pollen mixed with live black sapote pollen helps it overcome the barriers and pollinate khaki persimmons. So yeah, there's all these
Yes.
little tricks, and again, like these are things that used to be discovered really obscurely and didn't propagate, but now that we have the internet, people like you and me can start talking about it and telling other people. It's like, did you know there's this technique anyone in a backyard can do? And you, nobody's applied it to that particular combination of species before. Maybe you'll be the first person to do it.
Right. Because it's interesting, like people couldn't figure out for a while how to do American persimmon crossed with khaki. And even now, when people do that, it's done by embryo rescue.
Hmm.
But as I understand, the original cross to create that hybrid was done in the Ukraine with influence through Ivan Maturin's techniques. And it
Hmm.
was done by vegetative approximation, where
Hmm.
they'd essentially do that mentor graft, do enough horizontal hereditary information change. They're doing that mentor graft process and then pollinate pollinate each other on that same graft, as I
Yeah,
understand.
yeah,
And so they were too genetically distant before the graft to pollinate. And once they were grafted together in this technique, this specific form of grafting that encourages the flow of information between the sign and the mentor, they became genetically similar to do that cross. And that is fascinating because this is one of these obscure plant breeding techniques that, in a lot of ways, was scoffed off by the establishment as even pseudoscience or impossible, but
mm,
is the foundation of our hybrid persimmon culture in the United States. So perhaps black sapote and a hybrid persimmon could work through vegetative approximation
yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
I'll be trying that as well. I'll be trying that as well. Luckily, I love eating persimmons and black sapote, so there's no downside to planting dozens and dozens and dozens of them.
Right. I'm so interested in like what could happen if you introduce the black sapote genes, like perhaps getting some different pigments in the hybrid persimmon. Like my two loves are chestnut and persimmon.
Mm,
And I think that those together could be the bulk of a staple, woody staple crop for my
hmm.
climate.
Mm.
And if you're going to eat an enormous amount of persimmons, I think it'd be useful to get some different pigments in your diet than just an enormous amount of beta carotene. We don't need to like all turn orange in this future, persimmon culture that I'll be creating. So
I suspect a wide cross like that would set you up for selecting more storable forms of the fruit, either as whole fruit that just sit around in the cooler season, or maybe ones that dry down more easily, like they've got a lower moisture in the fruit to begin.
right,
Mm.
very exciting to see like yeah what kind of traits, what kind of emergent properties will come from, a triple hybrid, perhaps, mentor grafted to the earth after we get that seed. So first
It's
mentor graft and then mentor graft to the earth.
it's worth pointing out too, as a comparison, I think apples are a five-way hybrid of wild species from Kazakhstan.
Amazing.
I remember seeing it. I might be wrong. I might be wrong, and the study I'm citing might be wrong, even if I remember it correctly.
It's probably like more complex than that. The
Yeah,
study's
they're
going to
the
end up
five
being
that they
wrong.
could detect. Yeah, they're the five that they could detect definite signatures from. There could even be like microbial transfer between species on top of hybridization that led to domestication of apples. There's so much we don't know. Do you have a crop that you would create with a magic wand if you could just like will it into existence?
Yes, I would. Like, what got me thinking about this is I've seen experiments where if you cut a living branch and you pour water through one end of the branch, you create like a suction and have a water bottle where it puts water at the top of that branch. The water will go through the xylem of the plant.
Hmm.
And when it comes out the other end of the xylem, it will be purified water. I've
Mm.
seen videos where they'll do dirty water on one end of this living branch and then they tested the water on the other side and it purifies the water. So if I had a magic wand, I would create some kind of symbiotic relationship with a tree that is growing next to a pond where it creates some kind of like nipple out of a branch that just slow drips purified water.
That would be amazing. And like totally physically and ecologically plausible. If the relationship with the humans is such that the tree is, richly compensated for providing that service. It's interesting because there's so many, particularly in Australia, we've got so little surface water, but we've got a lot of groundwater. Those kind of species forming relationships with like livestock and other wildlife could completely transform landscapes in interesting ways. So you've got me there. That's one that I haven't actually thought about, and I'm impressed. I'm impressed. Now, let's move on to talking about the social networking side of getting breeders and low input growers together. Do you have any past experiences that have shaped your outlook on how, because I mean, herding humans in large groups, it's dangerous work. We're very unpredictable creatures at times. So do you have any thoughts on how people can help build functioning, mutually beneficial networks?
Well, we are the most complicated part, I think, of the ecosystem is us humans. And, like all organisms, I see us as an extension of our environment. And we exist in a pretty sick, dysfunctional environment. So it's not unsurprising. There's a lot of sick and dysfunctional humans. I think we need to create the set and setting for the the highest good of humans to flourish because humans are very adaptable. We're a very powerful species. We are one of the best species at destroying biomes and destroying life, but we're also for increasing the life process, for building succession. We have it's we're a reflection of our environment. We can go in either direction. So I feel like for creating functional human networks, there needs to be more done to create the proper set and setting for the best of humanity to spring forth. because I don't think we're defined by the worst of humanity. And I believe in humans. I believe in our potential of what's possible. It almost seems like it's a successional process of the kinds of social relations and social networks that I want to exist. I don't know if they're ready at the successional stage that we're at. We need to, plant the seeds and create the conditions for for us to
Is it almost
thrive and
is it almost like Facebook and TikTok and all that is like it's weeds and grass, like it's the most degraded, chaotic, disconnected kind of social structure that you can imagine?
yeah, pretty much. I would think so, but it's also like a bit of a mycelium network, so
Mm.
it's a little telepathic.
I mean, I guess in the same way
And
you could view the destruction of traditional cultures by industrial culture as an opportunity. It's like it's like a forest fire. It's cleared the landscape of a whole bunch of traditions that had cultural inertia that were very difficult to change. Like if you went back 400 years and told somebody, "Oh, we're going to try doing like hand pollination to create a new variety," they'd burn you as a witch or something. They'd think they wouldn't know, like they would have so many ingrained ways of doing things that they may not be open to trying different things. So again, maybe we can turn the mindset around that the disaster and the disruption of this time in history as an opportunity to try things that are completely different.
yes, 100%. We have quite the disturbance event, but we need to make sure we have the seeds in place to fill that gap. And I think that's the biggest riddle to wrestle is this human element. But as we build abundant food systems and beautiful places to live and healthy calories coming from the earth, I feel like that is possibly a prerequisite for, these new forms of social relations to emerge. A big problem is so many people are sick and are unwell and are
Mm.
being poisoned. And if foundationally shifting the food system and shifting where people are meeting their needs and their calories and their interaction with life, I'm just not sure how to create the
Do you
the,
think it
the
might be
kinds
a
of organizations I want
do you
without
think it might
that.
be a timing issue that we might still be too early for, like, until the industrial system stops being convenient, you can't expect anyone other than weirdos like you and me to really, devote our lives to an alternative.
Right. It's almost like we culture and a massive momentum. I'm not sure how to get that mass to have their interest, because if it's out of desperation, then we're kind of working from a scarcity mindset in
Mm.
a rocky foundation, and you know being led
It,
by cortisol and desperation. I want to be led by youthfulness and excitement. So it's almost like how to create, I don't know if a counterculture is the right thing, but an exuberance and excitement, um, making it cool to participate in life and ecology.
mm. Do you reckon the culture and dynamics around annual based civilization, it's in that kind of very short term cycle desperation of like having to put all of its energy into growing just enough grain to get it through the next year, and then they kind of get trapped. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
know, maybe that's our challenge of not waiting until the last minute when everyone's desperate and the only thing that has a chance of working is an annual crop. And the only way to make it grow is to disturb the, remaining ecosystem even more to make force a space for it. Um,
Mm-hmm. Right, like the stories of colonizers when they first come to oppress a group of people, cutting down all the food producing trees, create
Hmm.
them, dependence on, whatever kind of caste system that they're trying to impose. So I think desperately we need to be planting long lived trees everywhere that are food producing and adapted to people's climates.
But one thing I've looked at in history is a lot of regions have sacred groves. So in India and Ethiopia, I think in Lebanon, the only place you still find cedars growing are in churchyards that were had the goats fenced out. And I wonder if there's some opportunity for giving things a cultural significance before they have to have a practical significance.
Yes, that's beautiful. Perhaps
Mm,
it's like almost feels like it needs some sort of spiritual revival. I mean, the task seems so great that it almost feels like it needs some kind of spiritual awakening of some sort. And that's a tall order and mystical and often not very realistic, but sometimes I think that's the only option. Some kind of like 2012 style quantum upgrade of human consciousness, some kind of spiritual awakening, and who knows, maybe the life process that we're tapped into on this planet. Perhaps the intelligence of the planet could send some horizontal gene transfer over our way and do what must be done. Maybe it is all perfect and we're just mass disturbance event, and
mm.
soon enough the next successional stage of hereditary information will come flowing in for
Um,
gotta hope.
ha have you had any past experiences with groups and networks that have acted as kind of a cautionary tale? I know I've talked about my experiences in the past, and I almost feel like Western people today lack a training in how to come together in groups and like function together because we're so used to relying on the system to do everything, to intermediate everything for us. And we often find ourselves kind of shocked when we try and collaborate directly that we don't have the culture and the interpersonal skills.
Mm-hmm.
Or even think about like in the 20th century, there was a whole lot of community organizations where you would have a president and a secretary and a treasurer and you'd like run formal meetings and that worked very well, but those seem to be struggling with the social landscape today. They seem to be dying out, and getting skilled people to take on those key roles and keep those organizations going is getting harder and harder with every generation. So yeah, I'm just
Mm-hmm.
wondering if you have any thoughts about like how different social organizations come together and maybe where the sticking points are. Have you had any experience in any groups where you've seen things go off the rails?
Well, it's amazing. I'm always amazed when groups can function. That's pretty amazing. I feel like the more we get disconnected from the life process, the more we get disconnected from each other and traditional, you know, tribal human communities. It's almost like we all come from broken homes,
Hmm.
and there's a deep like spiritual sickness in humans, and we've forgotten in a lot of ways how to interact as a community through the atomized world and modernity. And there's just so much to relearn from just you know how to function as a group, and the mechanisms traditional groups created to prevent psychopaths from taking over, different taboos and things to maintain long intergenerational continuity without the sociopaths taking advantage of everyone. And yeah, we have a lot of relearning to do and training to do. And if we are going to resettle the landscape and create ecological communities, we're going to have to figure this one out.
Mm.
And some people are plant people and some people are animal people. I'm mostly a plant person. I i love humans, and I've had many amazing examples with humans, but I've also had a lot of bad experiences in a lot of different groups over the years where just a lot of people are sick, a lot of people are traumatized, and a lot of that comes out when they're in that you know vulnerable intimacy of really rooting with other people in like a in a in a communal way. And it seems like a lot of times in leadership positions, in a sense, leaders have to deal with a lot of bull crap. So it often takes, a tough person to to be in a leadership position, not necessarily like an authoritarian leadership position, but just like steering the ship or being like a vocalizer for a movement.
Mm.
And they have to deal with a lot. So a lot of times those are, tough, prickly people that can happen.
Mm.
Or sometimes like the most empathetic compassionate people are going to be turned off from being in that position.
Mm.
So it's like, what kind of people are able to stand that, and in the wrong conditions that can be like the narcissists
Mm.
or the people who shouldn't be in that position to begin with.
Do you
And
think it's partly an issue of scale? Like, to be the leader of 1 billion people, you almost have to be a psychopath. Whereas if you're in a group of 12 people, you'll just naturally have somebody who's a little bit more vocal and a little bit more motivated that will kind of be the leader, but nothing has to be formalized if it's a small enough group.
yeah, definitely scale essential. And the larger, I'm sure this gets more difficult. And I don't mean to like smear all organizations. I'm sure there's many amazing functional organizations exist with great leadership, and we should definitely learn from those people. But for each one of those organizations, there's many more that are extremely dysfunctional. And it's just unfortunate because often the most compassionate, empathetic people that you want involved in these orgs are the first people to get burned out and
Mm.
to exclude themselves.
Yep. Yep.
And so, kind of solving that problem,
I,
hopefully,
I
we can get
also
there.
I also worry with scale these days that anytime a group gets large enough to have power and or resources, there's perverse incentives for outsiders to come in and basically exploit that all that goodwill that's been put in one place.
Right, exactly. And that's the problem too of being atomistic with our projects, because
Mm.
we create just like little hubs of abundance and compassion and like good things happening. It's just the you know something that could be gobbled up in the future. It really shows the needed of a large network of you know connecting different groups in some kind of organization where they're confederated and interacting and have mutual aid and in connection with each other.
Do you have any thoughts on a related tricky problem of succession, particularly for breeding woody agriculture, like breeding woody tree species for agriculture? Because one person can devote decades of their life to building up an amazing stand of like selected genetics, but passing that on to somebody else to continue the work, or at least continue taking advantage of that existing stand and it not just being neglected or cut down by the next person who buys the property. I don't know. Do you have any insights into how to deal with that?
I've been wrestling with that for a while, and luckily I got started early, so I have a lot of time to think about it.
Hmm.
But I'm 34 now, but is to somehow continue this land project after I'm gone. So we have to have some sort of intergenerational plan of passing it off. And I'm sure there's a lot of people with projects they've devoted their life to. The income of what they would receive for passing it off is not the most important thing.
Hmm.
It's getting it into the right hands. And we'll see where we'll be in the future decades when I have to deal with that, because I'm in here for the long haul. And the last thing I want is to be another example of long-term projects getting bulldozed.
Mm.
And
Do you know what
we
I
need to
could
be
almost
creating.
do you know what I could almost see? Something like a religion that
Yes.
that recruits young people and screens them for being compatible with this like worldview. And then when older people such as you and me with a tree breeding project reach the end of our lives, they're available to say, okay, here are, monk, nun, XYZ will come in and take over that project and that property to continue it as a kind of sacred grove.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, what I kind of expect happening is like hopefully into my future, I have some sort of apprentice or
Mm,
something that I'd be able to pass it off on. But still, like one person can't necessarily take care of, a larger project. Ultimately, we need some kind of, you know, community, some kind of intergenerational movement.
hmm.
And yeah, it might be a spiritual revival, some kind of that literally might be what it takes. I'm not
Mm,
exactly sure. Perhaps because I have a larger piece of property for one person to take, maybe I'll turn it into like a land trust that there's different sections that get divvied up to different practitioners.
mm.
But for me and a lot of projects, we're very rural, so who wants to move out to those places? And then will they have access future sweetie pie to meet,
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
local coffee shop? Probably not. And so long term, it seems to be like, decentralized resettling of, the intact ecosystems that exist, and the rekindling of some kind of communal ecological culture that exists in the woods. And I suspect there'll be some sort of renaissance as people get increasingly disgruntled with modern life, with the emptiness of technology and the separateness and the market economy in the city, especially as resource decline increases and alienation increases. But there needs to be something created to for people to fall back on.
Yeah.
And so those networks, those frameworks of food systems, that plant breeding, those genetics, the pioneer species who came first to set the stage for what the future resettlement will look like.
It's it's a terrifying and beautiful time in history to be alive. And yeah, I'm just glad I get to talk to people like you and bounce these ideas around and just contemplate where it might all be going. And it's not all doom and gloom. That's the message I'm trying to spread, that there is so much there are seeds sprouting in all sorts of little obscure corners of the world that yeah, I'm hoping spreading this message will encourage more people to get involved in this kind of life path.
Exactly. There's just so much potentiality on the bare soil of this global disturbance event that is industrial civilization.
Mm. Okay, so we'll wrap up with a few final questions. So, what is your vision for the future of food in your community?
The future of food in my community looks like a thriving, intact, complex forest ecosystem. The future of food in my community has large, sweet fruits dropping all year long. We have dairy goats in the understory. We have chestnuts for fire, big smokehouses drying chestnut. I see the future of food stabilizing soil, building organic matter, increasing life, and having long lived, nutritious, non toxic food abundantly dripping from the sky. That is the ideal, because I think that is the foundation for what everything else kind of ripples out from. What is the ecological material conditions of a place? And the social relations that could come afterwards. So healthy food from woody plants, something for everyone, for the most sensitive among us, less stuff for the vegans, the omnivores, those with food sensitivities, and calling our dairy herd. So, there's occasional organ meat and muscle meat for everybody.
Wonderful. I can see it growing behind you right now in the background.
What was that?
I can see it growing in the background right behind you.
Yeah, with an understory of superfoods and forest medicine. But I see an overstory of chestnuts as our primary staple crop, with a diversified of fruits, largely based on persimmons, because those grow well in our region. So, and there's in the book Tree Crops of Permanent Agriculture, at the end of the chestnut chapter, he actually addresses my region. He says the Southern Illinois Ozarks, and he's calling us out. In this book from 1917, he's calling us out for our eroded hills and saying that, one day it shall be the hillsides of the Southern Illinois Ozarks should be dotted with chestnut trees. And it's amazing that influential book, like, specifically is calling me out.
And it's food for thought too, that there's been cycles of rising interest in these issues going back. I mean, you could probably find it in Roman times if there was enough documentation and you looked hard enough. And yeah, it's probably just going to be a matter of timing. Like, you can get like a false spring in cold climates. So like the seedlings germinate and then get frosted back. So maybe we're the third or fourth generation of seeds that have been waiting for the
Yes.
real spring to arrive.
Yes.
Who else do you think I should interview next?
Oh, I thought of someone just a little bit ago, and now I forget. I'm not sure. I'd interview Revel again, or Revel.
Yeah, he's
That
on
was
my list.
amazing.
He's on my list.
um, yeah, I'll be on the lookout. I'd love to find more people applying breeding to their syntropic agroforestry plans.
That's a huge synergy that I'm hoping to get people thinking about. So yeah, let me know. How can people learn more about your work or maybe get in touch if they want to follow up?
I'm Interwoven Permaculture, or Interwoven Farm. You can find me by just Googling that. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. You can email me, reach out. Love to connect with my fellow plant geeks, and happy to share and grow and be inspired by all the people listening.
Wonderful. And what's your final message for people thinking of getting into this style of local agriculture?
I would say follow your passion, follow your inner drive, your inner pleasure, those plants that attract you, and work with them and go from there and explore and have fun and keep it interesting.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. And maybe I'll check back in a few years and see how you're going.
That'd be amazing. Peace.
The Zero Input Agriculture podcast is a solo passion project built with my ample time and meagre resources. If you would like to support the show, then sign up for a paid subscription to my Zero Input Agriculture blog at Substack. As a reward, you can read all my past posts and listen to the audiobook of Taming the Apocalypse. If you prefer reading about the past and future of biological technology, you can read the ebook of Taming the Apocalypse through Amazon. And finally, please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you use, since it helps other people find me. Or recommend the show directly to anyone who could use some inspiration to become a plant breeder themselves.